From WFRV TV Local 5, your local election headquarters, this is Newsmaker Sunday with your host, Tom Zalaski.
Good morning. Welcome to Newsmaker Sunday. I'm Tom Zalaski. 2020, an election year in Wisconsin. It is also the year we will help to elect the next president of the United States. Here are some key dates for voters in our states. The spring primary on February 18th. That includes offices like state Supreme Court and local offices. That's followed by the spring general election and the presidential primary on April the 7th. Then in August, Wisconsin will hold a partisan primary, which includes the state Senate and Assembly, along with 8 of Wisconsin's congressional districts. And then November 3rd, the general election, where voters will elect candidates for those offices and, of course, help to decide who will be the President of the United States. Well, joining us this morning to talk about what to expect during this 2020 election year, Professor Michael Kraft, Professor Emeritus from UW Green Bay, frequent visitor to our show. We always appreciate it. A pleasure to have you on again.
Happy to be here.
Professor, generally, what's the landscape, political landscape here in Wisconsin right now? Are we in a lull? Are we not paying attention yet? Or are we still in Packer playoff mode?
Well, I think we are in Packer playoff mode, and I think people certainly have been paying attention to issues of impeachment in Washington, D.C. I don't think the election in Wisconsin has quite reached voter attention, and that's not unusual. That is, people often don't pay much attention to elections until we get very close. And it is, as you noted, some distance off. This year is going to be a little different because you have a president who attracts a lot of attention, both very positive and very negative, and very divisive in that sense, being more partisan. But that also means it's going to energize both sides earlier than I think would normally be the case.
We were a swing state, of course, in 2016. Are we more of a swing state in 2020?
We are certainly still a swing state. Most of the national calculators who look over every bit of political news still have Wisconsin rated among 3 toss-up states. So we could be looking at we're certainly going to get attention as a toss-up state. Whether it will be as close as it was in 2016, it was about 23,000 votes for the presidential election that separated Clinton and Trump. Whether it will be that close again remains to be seen, but a lot of people believe Wisconsin still is a state that is not easily called one way or the other.
And with that in mind, is that, in your view, the reason why the Democrats chose Milwaukee to hold their convention?
Conceivable.
Conceivable?
Conceivable. There is a certain art to selecting the convention city, and almost always it's because it either is likely to be a pivotal state in which it's held, or there's some hope that the state is transitioning from one party to another, and that maybe this will help. It's rarely about the economics of the city. It is a political calculation, and certainly Wisconsin, being one of the toss-up states, helped push us toward that.
Let's take a look at some recent numbers that were out. There are, of course, a host of Democrats looking to win this election. The Marquette Law School poll from December the 12th showing the top 4 candidates. Now, according to Democratic Party voters, the leaders include former Vice President Joe Biden, Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and Indianapolis Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Now, Professor, are they the front runners, or would you see the possibility of a dark horse entering this race at any point?
There's always the possibility of a dark horse, but the polls are looking at those who are declared and who've been in the debates. And certainly here there's not a huge variation from state to state, but people should be alert when you see the national polls. That is not an indication of how a given state will vote. We have the Marquette poll in Wisconsin, which does give us a breakdown for the state, and we have similar polls in Iowa and New Hampshire and other critical states where there's either a primary or a caucus. And in Wisconsin, Biden seems to be favored at the moment.
So at this point, it seems as though these 4 are the ones that we're going to be seeing and hearing the most of.
Yes, and of course there are others who still have not withdrawn from the campaign who will make an appearance. But whether that will change their status, the way the pollsters measure it, remains to be seen. The
billionaires, the Mike Bloombergs, the Tom Steyers, will their money take them only so far?
I think what we'll see is a lot of paid advertisements on television because they have the money to do it. So far, in neither case has it made much of a dent in their appeal to voters. And that's not surprising. I think voters are capable of understanding that billionaires can afford to spend a lot of money on advertisements. That is not an indicator of their popular support. And ultimately, the election is really about building support among voters. And those who survive to the end have a strong base of support, as President Trump clearly does, and certainly as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. They're all a little different in their positions, but they all have a different base. But it's really about raising that base enough that it becomes the dominant.
Right. Now, even with those four, some Democrats not happy with the field that's out there so far. Is there a possibility of a brokered convention in Milwaukee?
Well, I suppose there certainly could be. This is shaping up to be a contest in which Biden and Sanders and Warren and somewhat surprisingly Buttigieg are in competition. Should nobody win sufficient delegates, then you would have what we have not had for a long time,
do you
which
think
is a
the party,
brokered convention.
Does the party put safeguards in place, though, to make sure that doesn't happen? Because that doesn't look good on national TV.
It doesn't look good, but you know, we've gone from an era decades ago where the party leaders pick the nominees to where the public picks the nominees. Prior to 1968, party leaders were dominant. And then we've adopted more primaries and caucuses so that the ordinary voters have a choice. And that's both good and bad, because ordinary voters can pick somebody who, as pollsters and political scientists would put it, may not be electable. That is, they may be popular within the party but cannot win the general election. And obviously, for Democrats in 2016, there was a very hot contest between Clinton and Bernie Sanders. The Sanders people were very unhappy. They felt they were winning many of those contests. Clinton got the nomination and then couldn't succeed against Donald Trump.
Let me turn to the impeachment and some impeachment numbers here. Democrats are unified in removing Donald Trump from office, of course. Republicans seeing it the other way. The Marquette Law School poll, 40% support impeachment and removing the president from office. 52% are against it. And you've got some research here, too. What do those numbers tell you?
First, that Wisconsin is less pro-impeachment than the nation as a whole. Nationwide, most of the polls in the last week or two show a slight majority in favor or even 50-50. Wisconsin is less pushing for impeachment than other states by these numbers. But all these polls also are highly partisan. That is to say, if you separated out Democrats and Republicans, you would find overwhelmingly, not surprisingly, Republicans are against impeaching a Republican president and Democrats are in favor. And Wisconsin was the same. The numbers are that 80% of the Democrats in Wisconsin said impeach and remove, and only 4% of Republicans. A little more if you count leaning Republican versus leaning Democratic. But what you have is essentially Republicans saying we don't think it's fair, we don't think it's right, and Democrats, as they have been all along, highly critical of the president on other grounds than impeachment, favoring impeachment because they're convinced the evidence shows he abused the office and obstructed Congress, the two charges. And Republicans tend, as those who watched the impeachment proceedings saw, tend to be very skeptical of the witnesses and the evidence offered so far that it showed sufficient action by the president to warrant this very dramatic penalty of impeachment and removal. It's happened very rarely in U.S. history, and no president to date has ever been impeached and also removed from office. People are sometimes confused by that. We talk a bit about the history if it's useful.
And in fact, Nixon was not.
Yes, many people think Nixon was impeached and he left office because he was impeached. The House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach Nixon, but he resigned before it could get to a House vote. Now, he knew he would likely be impeached, and given the evidence, likely would have been removed from office. But technically, no, he was not impeached, except by the Judiciary Committee, not by the full House.
So he secured his place in history, so to speak.
Yes, he did.
We continue with Professor Michael Kraft right after this, so please stay with us.